I knew something was wrong the moment I opened my inbox and saw the subject line, Strategic Restructuring Discussion. It felt colder than a Boston winter, and I hadn't even had my first sip of coffee. A calendar invite followed instantly. Quick connect with leadership team. A quick connect is never quick, and it is certainly never a good sign. I clicked the link, and there they were. 3 blank-faced strangers with frozen smiles on my screen. Their names flickered like error codes. Marcus, Corporate Strategy. Lisa, HR Ops. And Ben, Integration Director. I didn't know what Ben meant by integration, but it smelled like someone who couldn't code their way out of a Google form. "Good morning, Maya," Marcus began, his voice smoother than a gas station wine cooler. "Thanks for hopping on. This should only take a minute." That's when it hit me. This wasn't a meeting. It was an execution. Have you ever been called a closure cost before your coffee could even reach 140 to GF? Have you ever been unpersoned in a Zoom by people who never met you, while your face is still pixelated because your camera is waking up slower than your dignity? If you're one of the 97% who listens to these stories without subscribing, go ahead and fix that now. Hit that little red button. Maybe drop a like too. It helps the crew behind this chaos keep the lights on. Trust me, we've all been there. And some of us came back with blood under our nails. Back to Maya. The thing about being the glue in a fragile ecosystem is no one notices you until the whole damn house falls down. For 12 years, I was the ghost in the machine. While others were arguing over lunch stipends and who gets what on the parking list, I was manually reconciling nightly batch jobs from 3 different legacy systems that hadn't been updated since Obama's first term. When Salesforce puked out garbage, I cleaned it. When their BI tool threw up null values, I patched it with handwritten SQL and duct-taped rejects. No applause, just a Slack emoji or a dry "appreciate it." Can you also? And I always could. I always did. But that morning, 9:03 a.m. sharp, they shut me out. "For smoother processing," Lisa said, muting my mic. My badge was deactivated. My access died in real time. Icons grayed out mid-click like tombstones. I watched my admin panel go cold as my name blinked off the internal directory. "Not even a thanks for your service," just Ben mumbling. "We'll take it from here." I didn't say a word. Didn't blink. Didn't cry. Because I had seen this movie before. The new COO, fresh from some tech bro nest, had been poking around my department for months, asking weird questions and talking consolidation and streamlining with the fevered look of a man trying to impress a boardroom full of divorced capitalists. And here's the kicker. Just last week, I saw the migration approval doc roll through, but without my sign-off. I'd built those systems, warned them not to rush, left internal comments flagged red, and they pushed it anyway, skipping the manual on a nuclear reactor because some intern watched a YouTube tutorial. As security escorted me down the glass corridor, I passed the wall of employee spotlights. My picture wasn't there. It never had been. But the guy who once caused a 6-hour outage by deleting a test environment in prod was front and center. Think big, fail fast. I walked past reception, my heels echoing like countdown ticks. Out the door and into the parking lot. The summer air hit me like static. I didn't rage, didn't flinch. I just sat in my car, keys in my lap, staring straight ahead as if watching a building burn that hadn't caught fire yet. Because I knew the dashboard deploy was scheduled for 9:15, and I knew exactly how brittle those integrations were without my invisible, undocumented hotfixes. And they had no goddamn clue what was about to hit them. "Effective immediately," the HR rep said, reading with the shaky confidence of someone who still double-checks their own name on emails. Her voice had all the warmth of a robocall scam. "Your position has been deemed redundant under the current restructuring plan. You are categorized as a closure cost, like I was a moldy file cabinet they were finally chucking into a dumpster." I stared at my Zoom window, myself in one square, those smug, laminated faces in the others. No one made eye contact. Marcus, from Corp Strategy, was pretending to squint at a spreadsheet that didn't exist. Lisa from HR bit her lip like she was passing a kidney stone. Ben just nodded along like a bobblehead who had seen too much and still knew nothing. "This decision is final," the rep continued. "We'll be revoking access shortly. You should have received a DocuSign for your exit documents and NDA. If you have any personal belongings..." My Gmail tab blinked. Logged out. Black disconnected. VPN tunnel collapsed like a cheap tent in a thunderstorm. Then my screen twitched. The admin console I'd kept open out of habit, a sixth sense, flashed one last time. And just before it vanished, I saw it. Production push. Analytics Hub V4.3 live. Live without my approval. For a moment, it was like my blood slowed. Not rage. Not yet. Just pure, distilled disbelief. "You're letting that go through?" I said, unmuting myself. My voice cut like steel wire. That release wasn't validated. The staging environment was showing incomplete data mapping as of Thursday. "Oh," Ben piped in, caught off guard like a man just asked to explain quantum physics at a frat party. "Yeah, we looped in the vendor. They gave the green light. It should be fine." "The vendor?" I nearly laughed. The vendor's implementation guy once asked if Jason was a new AI chatbot. But sure, let's trust him with a $40 million dashboard rollout. "No one pulled my final merge request," I said flatly. "I left a block on that pipeline for a reason." Marcus cleared his throat. "We've got it covered. Let's keep things professional, please." Professional. Like stripping someone's name off 12 years of infrastructure while she's still sitting in the goddamn chair is just another Monday in Q3. "Security will escort you from the premises," HR said, reading past the part where anyone cared. I stood slowly. My chair gave that familiar creak like even it was confused. I didn't argue, didn't protest, just unplugged my mouse, my own, not company issued, and slid it into my purse. A $12 mouse from Target, but somehow it felt like a relic now. My thumb had worn the plastic smooth. As I walked out, I caught my reflection in the office glass, a blur in a sea of polished wood and sanitized lighting. And suddenly, it was all too funny. 12 years of wrangling legacy code, calming down panicked sales execs at 3 a.m., building patches for systems duct-taped together since the Bush era. And now, I was reduced to a closure cost by someone whose greatest achievement was surviving his own onboarding. The elevator was waiting. I stepped in without looking back. Down, down, down. When the doors opened, the security guy was already there. Carl, a nice guy, had a grandkid born last month. He looked at me with a tight little nod, like he'd seen too many good ones marched out like this. No words, just protocol. He scanned my badge. It blinked red, deactivated at exactly 9:03. I handed it over. "Keep it," I said. "Might be worth something once the place burns down." Carl tried not to react, but the corner of his mouth twitched. He pushed open the lobby door into the Ohio heat, air thick with pollen and the slow rot of early summer. Somewhere inside, someone was probably trying to figure out why the dashboard still showed test data for the firm's biggest client. And upstairs, they were saying the words, "We'll take it from here." God help them. The marble floor echoed with every step, sharp, deliberate clicks that sounded like a countdown. I didn't speed up. I didn't slow down, just walked straight through the silence, past the awards wall filled with names I didn't recognize. Most of those plaques were for people who couldn't even spell interoperability, let alone debug a data stream at 2 a.m. during a client panic. I wasn't angry, not yet. It was something colder, sharper, like when you bite down on tinfoil and hit a nerve. That damn dashboard push. They approved it without me. Without me. I had written the deployment script by hand when Jenkins kept timing out. I had rerouted the client data flow through a patched cron job because the vendor's import parser treated null like a personality trait, and I had explicitly told them not to push live until I could verify the data reconciliation scripts were completing cleanly. But now it was in production, unchecked, untested, and they really thought I was the closure cost. I stepped outside into a heat wave that smelled like melting tar and forgotten ambition. My Honda Civic sat baking in the far corner of the lot, right where I always parked, out of habit, out of ritual, out of a weird respect for the early interns who needed the close spots to feel like they mattered. As I approached, my phone vibrated 3 times with notifications from my personal Gmail. Alerts I'd set up forever ago, tied to the shadow token I'd embedded into the backup admin service. A failsafe, just in case. They hadn't disabled it. Of course they hadn't. They didn't even know it existed. Dashboard v4.3 live. Data flow stalled. Error log growing. I didn't smile, but something in my spine straightened. I sat in the driver's seat, letting the AC struggle to cough out cold air, and just stared through the windshield. Up there on floor 8, someone was realizing that their beautiful new dashboard, the one the CEO bragged about at the last shareholder sync, was feeding garbage data into the executive summaries. KPIs that used to be gospel now looked like a drunk spreadsheet had vomited into a pie chart. And still, no one had texted me. No apology, no follow-up, not even a panicked, "Hey, do you remember how the anomaly detection logic works?" They didn't get it. Not yet. But they would. I pulled out my notebook. Not a laptop. A spiral-bound notebook that looked like it had been through a war. Coffee stains, ink smears. One corner held together with an old Trader Joe's sticker. Inside were years of handwritten fixes, notes I never committed to any repo, patches they never documented, workarounds no vendor ever approved. But that kept the system breathing through budget freezes and 3 different CIOs who all swore they were going cloud native while forgetting what SFTP even stood for. I flipped to the section marked V4.3. My own handwriting stared back at me in black Pilot G2 ink. Do not deploy prod without localized datestring cleanup. Client region equals APAC fails on null. Underlined twice, with a red sticky note still attached. Talk to Ben. Staging failures. No fix yet. But they pushed anyway. I turned my head slowly toward the office tower. It was still standing, still made of glass, steel, and misplaced faith, but something inside was cracking. I could feel it, like hearing a far-off smoke alarm and knowing exactly what room's on fire. 12 years I'd held that place together with no net, no team, no backup, and now they were free-falling without even realizing the parachute had my name stitched into it. I leaned back in the seat, watching the shimmer of heat rise off the building. No tears, no rage, just the slow birth of a plan. 6 months earlier, a vendor came in with toothy smiles and a pitched deck thicker than a Bible, but twice as full of fantasy. They called it a strategic migration, said their SaaS platform would future-proof the analytics ecosystem, said words like agile, modular, and low maintenance. They may as well have been reading from a horoscope. I sat in the back of the kickoff meeting, chewing on the same pen I'd had since the SharePoint migration in 2018, and asked for a full data architecture doc. They handed me one. They blinked at it like it was in hieroglyphics. The problem wasn't the vendor. It was the bones. Their infrastructure was a graveyard of patched-together services. One core system dated back to 2009, held together by a Linux distro no one dared update. Half the data flow depended on a retired API whose only documentation was a post-it note taped under my old manager's keyboard. The other half piped through nightly jobs that failed silently unless you checked the logs like a priest reading omens. I had learned early. Never trust a green bar. Green just meant we didn't look hard enough. I tried to warn them in meetings, in Slack threads, even in my quarterly review where I finally broke character and said, "This thing isn't plug and play, it's plug and pray." But they didn't listen. They handed off the entire dashboard project to Ben, the same guy who once crashed the QA environment by pasting code from a blog without changing the variable names. He smiled at me and said, "I think we'll be fine. The vendor's handling the heavy lifting." I nodded politely, then went back to my desk and started laying sandbags. At night, while the office emptied and the PMs clicked off for Pilates and frozen dinners, I stayed behind writing patches, little ghost scripts, silent jobs. Validators that would comb through incoming streams and clean the rot before it infected the reports. I didn't check them into Git, didn't document them, knowing they would just get overwritten by the next eager consultant. No, these were mine. I named them things like Ghostpipe V2 and Do Not Touch MTXD. They saved the system more times than I could count. The new dashboard couldn't handle certain currency formats. I wrote a parser. The vendor's ingest tool broke when users had double spaces in their names. I wrote a regex that would have made a monk weep. When the sales team started pulling quarterly forecasts and the revenue numbers came back as Nan, I didn't escalate. I didn't yell. I stayed late, traced the issue back to a malformed column in the legacy CRM export, and wrote a silent fix that reformatted every entry before it touched the analytics layer. Nobody thanked me, just said, "Glad that's over." They never asked why it worked. They never knew it only worked because I was still there. Every time the system stuttered and caught itself, they thought it was stable. It wasn't. It was Maya. I was the firewall between the old world and the new one, between data integrity and a CFO screaming into a metrics void. So when they kicked me out, they didn't just fire an analyst. They pulled the pin on the only grenade that still had its safety on. And now the blast radius was growing, quietly, patiently, because brittle systems don't explode instantly. They crack. And I knew exactly where those cracks would start to bleed. 9:17 a.m. The dashboard was supposed to auto-populate with the morning metrics, quarterly pipeline health, churn risk analysis, lead velocity, NPS heat maps, the usual gospel the execs like to quote in town halls as if they personally conjured it from the heavens. Instead, it loaded a screen so blank it looked like the void stared back. One brave sales rep, Gina from Enterprise West, refreshed her tab 5 times before realizing her pipeline forecast showed $0. Her entire client book wiped. Her Slack message read, "Am I being fired, or is the dashboard on acid?" Then came the flood. Sales ops couldn't pull regional metrics. RevOps was getting null values from the attribution model. East Coast territory managers screamed that all of APAC's KPIs had been replaced with French labels and default dates from January 1st, 1970, epic time. I had warned them. The war room spun up in less than 5 minutes. The CTO, Carl Melvin, a man who used to brag that he hadn't written code since 2007, stormed into the glass box conference room, clutching his phone like it owed him money. "Who signed off on this push?" he barked. "Where's Maya?" Everyone froze. An intern dropped her kombucha. Ben stammered something about vendor sign-offs and final merges. No one looked directly at Carl. "Who ran the deploy?" he asked again, slower this time, without Maya's validation tag. Silence. The senior PM, Jules, who once told me to trust the process after my staging environment caught on fire, finally muttered, "We assumed she'd signed off before she left." Left? She didn't leave. She was terminated. And that's when it clicked. They'd pushed live without me, without the patches, without my undocumented fixes. They'd walked into the operating room, fired the surgeon, and handed the scalpel to a guy who couldn't spell anesthesia. The Slack thread labeled Hat Analytics Support exploded into DEFCON 1. "At Ben, did you push the full prod pipeline or just the merge?" At vendor, we're seeing format issues in the APAC stream, possibly related to legacy date strings. At Carl Melvin, who the hell approved this deployment without Maya? At PM Jules, we assumed vendor had validated staging. At Carl Melvin, she wrote, staging. Meanwhile, the CEO, fresh off a red-eye from Denver, was already on a live call with one of their biggest enterprise clients, trying to explain why the live metrics showed a 138% churn rate and a customer lifetime value of $114. Back at my old desk, someone opened my shared folder. Inside were 3 files, none of them helpful. readmefirst.txt, last modified in 2.1. Legacy fixes, final v3. docx password protected. And a .png file of a skeleton in a server room with the words, I told you so. Someone from HR wandered by the war room and tapped on the glass. Carl, just checking. Should we start updating the release notes? Carl didn't even look at her. Get me her number. Who's Maya's? She signed an NDA. Her exit's final. He paused, eyes twitching. Did she? Down in legal, they were already scrambling through my paperwork. Upstairs, 3 sales directors shouted over each other about why their Salesforce integrations were returning leads from last year. One even claimed her own birthday had been overwritten in the client table. The CTO stared at the giant wall screen where their analytics dashboard, a $2.3 million investment, now displayed one lonely red box. Data source not found. And still no one knew how to fix it because the only person who could was gone. They didn't just fire me, they deleted their lifeline. I didn't gloat. I wasn't the villain in this story, no matter how many times they tried to paint me as difficult for insisting that client data shouldn't be funneled through spaghetti code and wishful thinking. I sat cross-legged on my couch, laptop balanced on a cushion, chamomile tea going cold beside me. The cat, Larry, 17 seas of pure judgment, snored under the window. My screen showed the admin console. They forgot to revoke access from a token, a shadow one, born from a forgotten Jenkins container I'd provisioned 2 reorgs ago, back when they were migrating to serverless, but still asked me how to restart a cron job. The log feed scrolled errors, warnings, stacked traces like angry poems, and then the familiar panic. I saw my own name popping up in Slack threads, being screenshotted and dumped into Jira tickets titled Urgent, Need Maya's Patches. It wasn't malice I felt. It was something quieter, something bone deep. Of course you need me. They were pulling old documents now. PDFs I'd written back when their entire revenue forecasting model ran on Excel macros and broken dreams. I saw someone trying to parse a 27-page doc titled Historical Integration Pain Points, Draft, Do Not Share, a file I only wrote to blow off steam after a month of fixing the same broken currency conversion 3 times. None of it was current. None of it helped. The real fixes weren't written. They were lived. I knew the vendor couldn't help. They didn't know about the silent job I'd scheduled locally to clean up time zone mismatches in the APAC feed. They didn't know about the retry scripts I'd manually set in place when their batch job scheduler flaked out during daylight savings. I saw them digging through the wreckage of my documentation, like archaeologists who just unearthed a cursed temple and couldn't figure out which inscriptions meant gold inside and which meant run. My phone buzzed. No number. I let it go to voicemail. Then another blocked caller. Then a text from Jules, the PM. Hi, Maya. Hope you're doing okay. Quick question. Do you remember what script ran cleanup on the APAC ingestion before the dashboard sync? Sorry to bug you. I turned off my phone. Let it sink in. I'd asked for help so many times. Quietly, politely, then with increasing urgency. Just one more hire. Just a junior analyst to train. Just an intern to shadow me for the love of God before I died under a mountain of unlogged fixes and emergency data band-aids. The last budget cycle, I got back a single comment. Let's revisit this in Q4. Tight margins. But somehow they had a budget for kombucha on tap and a mindfulness app nobody used. Now they were finally seeing it. I wasn't an employee. I was the scaffolding, and the second they tore me down, the whole circus tent came crashing in on their peacock feather dashboards and artisanal KPIs. I refreshed the log feed. 6 new error types. One of them I hadn't even seen before. Looked like someone tried to roll back part of the deployment manually and broke the regional locale parser for Europe. Now their Dutch clients were showing up with Korean country codes. Classic Ben. I sipped my tea. It was lukewarm, but the satisfaction, that was piping hot. The call came just after sundown. Unknown number again, but this one didn't smell like desperation. It smelled like opportunity. I let it ring twice, then answered like I hadn't been watching their system logs all day, with the focus of a retired general reading enemy war dispatches. "Hi, is this Maya Quinn?" The voice was young, crisp, and too enthusiastic for someone working past 6 p.m. "My name's Lex. I'm with Vanguard Analytics, a competitor of your former employer. I mean, recent employer. I heard you might be open to new opportunities." I raised an eyebrow. Vanguard, the company that had tried to poach our enterprise clients twice in the last year? The same folks who built dashboards so slick you'd think they were forged in a VC-backed sweatshop. If they were calling me, it meant one of two things. Either someone inside was talking, or someone inside needed saving. "I'm listening," I said, sipping a fresher cup of tea this time. "What do you need?" "Well," Lex said, his voice softening just enough to betray the real purpose of the call. "We've, heard about some turbulence across the river. One of our shared clients mentioned your name very positively, I might add. Said you basically built the integration that was keeping their executive dashboard stable. And well, now it's not." I leaned back, staring at the crack in my ceiling that had been there since the last hard winter, and smiled just slightly. "I can walk you through how they failed," I said, "but only if we're having a real conversation, not one of those fishing expeditions." "Oh, absolutely," Lex said quickly. "We'd love to bring you in, even consultatively, just to get a sense of—" "Great," I cut in. "Send an NDA and your client roster. If I see overlap, we talk." I hung up and stared at the soft glow of my screen. The Jenkins token was still active, still feeding me error logs. Part of me considered pulling the plug, letting it go. But another part, the part that had spent over a decade cleaning up behind people who thought cloud meant Google Drive, decided against it. I opened my old ThinkPad, not the work-issued machine, the real one. The one with the bootable Linux distro, local Git snapshots, and a nested folder system titled Maya's Doomsday. Don't push this unless they deserve it. Inside were handwritten schema maps, query optimizations, an entire folder labeled vendor lies with timestamp documentation of every promised feature that failed in production, screenshots, code diffs, annotated reports with comments like "this breaks if the client has more than 1,000 SKUs. They all have more than 1,000 SKUs. I wasn't archiving this for revenge. I was archiving it for leverage. The next person who underestimated me would have to step over a minefield of organized, weaponized competence. No firewalls, no gag orders. Just one woman with a brain full of battle scars and receipts they forgot she kept. I opened a fresh Google Drive, private, encrypted, backed up to a cold storage server I paid for myself, and dragged the entire folder in. I calmly renamed it Closure Cost V1.0. That night, while my former office scrambled to spin up a fix, and legal tried to figure out why my NDA wasn't actually countersigned, I sat with my cat and watched reruns of Columbo. Larry snored, oblivious. The dashboard log slowed for a bit, then spiked again. I didn't flinch. This wasn't vengeance. Not yet. This was the spark in dry grass. All I had to do now was wait for the wind. Thursday morning, the office smelled like scorched pride and stale oat milk. Their biggest client, Drex Systems, a Fortune 100 logistics beast that practically printed money, had stopped replying to emails and instead issued a formal notice of material concern. Translation: fix this or we walk. Their dashboard was still down. Metrics were frozen, duplicated, or just plain wrong. Some C-suite genius even suggested blaming API latency, like I hadn't literally hard-coded a delay buffer for that exact issue 9 months ago and then documented it twice. The CEO's assistant called an emergency exec sync at 6:45 a.m. Carl Melvin, the CTO, arrived late and sweating, his hair still wet and socks mismatched. Ben looked like he'd slept in the server room, which was generous because he'd never even seen the server room. Jules, the PM, had printed my old documentation and scattered it like tarot cards across the conference table, hoping one of them would summon a fix. Nothing worked. Then came the email. Subject line: Dodrex Q2 Compliance Audit. Data integrity flagged. The cabal turned ghost white. Legal scrambled. Compliance flagged it as critical. Drex's internal auditors found 3 mismatches in their revenue attribution funnel tied to data that passed through my now dead validation script. Data that should have never made it into reporting. And buried in the audit trail, missing approval metadata, specifically my digital sign-off. Carl, red-faced and vibrating, slammed his hands on the table. Get me her number. HR blinked. We terminated her access. She signed the NDA. Legal chimed in from the corner. Actually, we may not have finalized that document. It looks like it was generated and sent, but there's no counter-signature. And she didn't cash the severance check yet. Carl's eye twitched so hard it looked like a seizure. So she's not legally bound to confidentiality. Not unless she agrees to it. Technically, she's still a free agent. The CEO rubbed his temples like he could squeeze a different reality out of his skull. Meanwhile, I was at home, organizing my notes for Vanguard's onboarding call. Larry was parked on my lap, shedding like a dying Christmas tree. I was halfway through color-coding schema conflicts when my phone lit up again. Blocked caller, voicemail, then a text. Maya, it's Carl. We need to talk. Compliance is all over us. Can we discuss a short-term consulting retainer, please? I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded my contract to a lawyer friend, Shonda, a beast of a woman who once made a VP cry during a lunch meeting. 30 minutes later, Shonda called, chuckling darkly. Girl, you're going to love this. Oh, your contract, Section 6, buried under the Asset Inventory Clause. You're still listed as a mandatory signatory on all infrastructure architecture approvals for production-facing systems, including analytics. I blinked. Wait, even post-termination? Yep. They wrote it as perpetual unless formally amended by you or your written designee, meaning they needed your explicit sign-off before pushing anything substantial live, including that dashboard disaster. I sat back, tea in hand, watching a blue jay slam into the window and fly off like it meant to do that. So, they violated their own compliance protocols. Yep. And now they're getting audited. Yep. I didn't laugh, just breathed deeply. I told them they were playing Jenga with an earthquake forecast taped to the wall. They smiled, nodded, and handed the vendor the final piece. Now they were buried under the rubble, and I still had the blueprint. The video call opened with the usual corporate throat clearing, blurry webcams, and muted hellos. Top left, the client's compliance officer, Angela, stone-faced and professionally pissed. Top center, Maya Quinn, camera steady, lighting soft, gaze unwavering. Bottom row, the CTO, Carl Melvin, sweating bullets in 1080p. Next to him, the COO, Marcus, stone gray, lips pressed so tight they looked vacuum-sealed. Angela opened. Thanks for joining. Let's begin the post-mortem and solution discussion. Our new consultant will walk us through the stabilization process. Carl's eyes twitched and blinked like someone had jammed a pencil into his memory. "Consultant?" he croaked. I leaned in slightly, folding my hands with the kind of poise you earn only after surviving 12 years of budget cuts, gaslighting, and being called a people person instead of being given a damn raise. "Hi, Carl." "Marcus," I said, my voice calm as still water with a current underneath. Their faces contorted in a synchronized display of corporate heartburn. Angela glanced at her notes. "Maya Quinn is now on retainer as our tech recovery liaison. We understand she built or maintained key components of the data infrastructure. She'll be advising us on next steps." Carl stammered. "This is completely inappropriate. She's a former employee under NDA." "I never signed your NDA," I said, my eyes locked on his. "You forgot to click submit." Silence. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it, possibly reconsidering every life decision since junior year. I clicked my screen. A document opened. Clean, professional, deadly. "This," I said, "is a real-time triage doc. It outlines which patches I wrote, which undocumented workflows you broke, and which live client data feeds you've corrupted. You pushed a production update without validating the regional ingestion schemas. You ignored all my warnings, fired the only person who knew where the duct tape was." Angela nodded. "We've confirmed several of these gaps during the audit." Carl cleared his throat. "We didn't realize." "You didn't care," I cut in. "You wanted a clean closure. So, let me give you one." I pulled up a second tab, an executable time-stamped and labeled clearly. Prod sync failsafe V1. This script reestablishes regional data integrity, rolls back the faulty mappings, and restores historical metrics for top-level dashboards. It requires my execution key. "You don't have it." Carl was pale. "Now you're blackmailing us." I smiled softly. "I'm offering you a lifeline." Angela raised her hand. "Maya, your terms. I didn't miss a beat. 6-month consulting retainer. 6 figures. I choose the scope. I choose the hours. I choose which vendor cowboy gets a leash. You pay on time. No net 45. Angela nodded. "Approved." Carl looked like he'd swallowed a lit cigarette. "You can't." "Seriously, your legal team already verified the clause?" I added, my tone glacial. "My signature is still required for any infrastructure approval tied to external client delivery." "You forgot to remove me. Closure cost, remember?" Marcus opened his mouth. Nothing came out. It was beautiful. "I warned you," I said, leaning closer. "You wanted tidy. You wanted seamless. You wanted closure." I clicked the script. This is what closure looks like. The dashboard logs began to settle. Data reconciled. Numbers snapped back into place like they were relieved to be seen again. Drex's compliance officer smiled for the first time all week. The call ended. Cameras clicked off one by one. I sat alone in the digital silence, tea warming my hands. They thought I was disposable. I proved I was the damn keystone, and now they paid me to watch them beg. The most terrifying thing for any company isn't external sabotage, but losing the one person who quietly held everything together. This story reminds us that true value isn't always visible. It isn't found in flashy titles or on corporate awards walls. It exists in the quiet dedication, the long nights, and the deep institutional knowledge that often goes unnoticed. The lesson is simple. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They are often the foundation, and when you dismiss them, you risk your entire structure collapsing. The positive message to the audience is that your competence is your greatest asset. Cultivate it diligently, even when no one is watching. Your hard work, expertise, and integrity are a powerful currency that no one can take away from you. When you are confident in your value, you hold the power to shape your own future, turning what seems like a setback into your greatest opportunity.